In this series, I'll be showing you from start to finish how I'm making this custom wireless keyboard with two very large batteries. From testing, designing, prototyping, and finally putting it all together in a completed build. I have a crazy amount of things to do, so let's go. As most of you probably already know, I've made two other wireless conversion keyboards. Both of those keyboards had one limiting factor that this keyboard is going to decimate. Without further ado, let's dive into the parts. Not one, but two giant batteries, a keyboard, duh, some huge LEDs, a USB voltmeter, and the Bluetooth wireless adapter. From my previous builds, I have become extremely proficient at tearing into these portable battery banks. Now, I am not sponsored in any way, but this particular battery bank is my favorite out of all of the ones that I've tried. I think I picked this up for like 13 bucks. Not only does it have a huge battery capacity at 6,000 milliamp hours at 5 volts, but it also comes with this little LED bendable light, which is super bright, and also this carrying case. You get so much more, and it's a quality battery. And believe me when I tell you that I have the receipts. I have been probably through 20 different brands, different sizes, everything. Not only is it a good battery, but it's also easy to disassemble, which I can't say for the rest of them. And what's this? I have two of them. Two identical ones. Yes, I have two batteries, and I am going to attempt to stuff two giant batteries into a keyboard case. And I know you're thinking to yourself, well, what kind of a case is this crazy man trying to find that is going to have enough room for two giant batteries that are almost bigger than the keyboard itself? And that is an excellent question, and one I will answer later on in this series. Next up on the parts list is this USB voltmeter. It's not entirely useful, but it does look really cool, which now that I think about it might be the overall theme of this build. If you go back and watch my last wireless conversion, you'll see how much I struggled with intercepting the power and data lines to the PCB. Because of the nature of this new design, I no longer have to deal with that. So now let's get into my initial thoughts of why I'm even making this keyboard and why is it going to be better than my other two builds. The main challenge of my first two builds was trying to fit all of the components, including the battery, inside of the original case. As soon as I started building my first one, my immediate thoughts were, wow, this would be a lot easier if I could make my own case. I always wanted to have longer run times, but that was dictated by the physical constraints of how big the battery could be inside of the case. If I create my own case, that opens it up so that I can use much larger batteries or even multiple battery packs. So in the back of my mind, I've been wanting to build this keyboard for a long time. The biggest challenge initially was just how was I going to lay out this board? Was I going to try to make it as compact as possible while still having a giant runtime? Or was I going to try something different and maybe lay out some components in different areas and show them off? I don't know. I had a lot of ideas and I went through a bunch of iterations on trying to figure out what was going to look the coolest. Was I going to leave the charge circuits accessible so you could plug into them and charge other things while you're using the keyboard? That would be pretty cool. With it laid out like this, it's not going to be that much bigger than the regular keyboard, albeit it will have to be quite a bit thicker just to be able to fit the batteries right here. I couldn't really put the batteries directly underneath the board like this because I was fighting with the dip switches which are on the underside of this particular keyboard. I poured a ton of time and effort into figuring out what was going to be the best layout, and I will get much more in depth in that in the next episode. But first, we have to test to make sure everything works outside of a case before I go and spend a whole ton of time making something that might not even work. Can I even make a wireless conversion that has two separate batteries? I've never done it before. Can I also throw in an inline voltmeter that turns on and looks cool when you turn the keyboard on? That's what we're going to find out. Could I design the case to also house the case of the voltmeter? I sure could, but PCBs look cool and we want to show that off. We also need to try and slim things down because with these epic Chungus batteries, this is definitely going to be a thick boy and we don't need it to get any thicker. One of my viewers said you can use rose solder to help desolder these pads. I just attack them with a flush cutter. I don't even bother trying to desolder them. Or if you have a hot air station like Louis Rossmann, you can do this a bunch of different ways, but I think this is the easiest method. And what you're left with are some traces that are pretty close together to solder to, but this is nothing compared to my last mini wireless keyboard build. That was a nightmare. I have to say, at this point of the build, I really didn't have any indication of where the components were going to go or where they were going to be laid out. I just knew which components I had, and I needed to make sure that I could make this work with two different batteries going on. I was already familiar with this Vortex keyboard and how to wire it up with one battery, so I figured adding another one shouldn't be too difficult. And you might be asking yourself, well, why do you even need two batteries? Why don't you just go and buy one bigger battery, because you already know how to wire that up? Which I could do that, you're right, but I already have a ton of power banks lying around, and also putting in two different batteries is more challenging, so that's why I'm doing it. Of course, as with all my other builds, I will be doing a wired to wireless switch that is hardware switched. Also, side note, it's always a good idea to label your polarities, especially if it's some component you're going to be soldering to and from multiple times. I have a ton of these blue Sharpies. I just write the polarity once and then I never have to check the pin out again because I know it's correct. If you don't really understand what I mean when I'm saying a hardware switched wired to wireless toggle, then please go back and watch my first conversion video, because that is much more of a tutorial and I go very in depth about it. My normal way of making the switch from wired to wireless modes is using these very tiny relays. It would be really cool if I could just bypass these relays and wire everything directly, but because of how this keyboard's firmware is, you need to physically swap the data lines on it. Otherwise, when you're trying to go from wired to wireless, the signals start fighting each other and then it's just a mess and it doesn't work. Also, side note, I have so many broken USB cables that I no longer purchase small wires like this. If I ever need more wires, I don't order on Amazon, I just use one of my dead USB cables, strip the wiring out, and it's the perfect gauge and everything. Even though this isn't the most exciting part of the build, it is fundamental, because once we get past this, then we can get on to the more designing and creative aspects of the build. Because I'm dealing with two batteries, I did have to make some choices here on how I was going to wire them up. Now, I did get the relay working, but when I was doing this, I realized because I'm making my own case, that means I have room for different kinds of switches, and my favorite are toggle switches. To replace the small relays, I'm using a triple pole, triple throw toggle switch, and I need two of them. Everyone knows that toggle switches are the coolest switches, and that is undebatable. Fight me in the comments, come at me, bro. I'm using one toggle to switch between wired and wireless modes, and I'm using the other toggle to switch from one battery to the other. That's right, these batteries are going to be independent of one another. That means when I'm using one battery and I drain it all out, I flip the toggle and I have a whole nother pack full of juice right there. I know you're wondering, why don't you just wire them in parallel and then you'll get double the capacity and it'll act as one battery? I would do this, but I have read on many forums to not do this with two battery banks. Do not wire them in parallel. I've heard things from one battery is going to be doing way more work than the other, and it's going to deplete it faster, and then that's going to cause them to be imbalanced and other things, just bad stuff like that. Everywhere I've read said do not do this, but I'm not exactly sure if that's true, considering each one has their own charge circuit, which is basically a BMS. So if you know the answer to this and it is a definitive no, then let me know in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious. I might actually just try to do this in a separate project just to test it out myself, see if anything bad happens. But for this particular build, I am making them independent to err on the side of caution. The only downside is that if one of the packs runs out, you're going to have a brief intermission while you flip that toggle switch and wait for things to reconnect. I personally don't find this to be a huge annoyance, but you might, and that's fine. One benefit is that you can charge one of the batteries independent of the other one that you're using, and I have heard that this is better for the battery. As I was wiring up my toggles, I did make one mistake, and here you can see me trying to get it to run off of the battery, and it simply just wasn't working. You can see me trying to turn on the battery and it's just not working, even with the power button being turned on, so I wasn't quite sure what was going on here. I figured it might have been the voltmeter that I wired in, so I grabbed the USB port to just make sure my pinouts were correct, because this one I didn't label with my blue marker. To me, this still wasn't making sense to me because I knew that the voltmeter was hooked up correctly, so I decided to plug it into the wall just to make sure that the voltmeter was reading and everything was okay that way. Even though this circuit is not terribly complicated, once you have all these wires going every which way, it can get pretty easy to mix things up a little bit. I've done things like this so many times now that I don't always follow my own circuit design, so I'm just like, yeah, I know what that does, and then I'll wire it up and it'll be incorrect. So now you can see it working, the keyboard is turned on, the voltmeter is reading, and also my wireless adapter is also working. So I at least know that this part of the circuit is working, the part that isn't tied to the battery, so now I have to figure out why isn't this working when I plug it into the battery, or what is going on with that. If you want a deeper explanation of this circuit design, I will go over it a bit more in the next episode, but I really encourage you to watch my first wireless conversion video because that one is fully in depth and you will know exactly what I'm doing here. After playing around with it a bit more, I re-referenced my own circuit design that I made and I figured out what was going wrong, and it was this toggle switch right here. I think I got twisted up because I didn't realize that the toggle was switching like horizontally instead of vertically. But after I was able to fix this mistake, and thankfully nothing blew up, and now my battery works again. And as you can see, it's running off of the battery. The keyboard is working, my wireless is working, everything is working as it should. Now with all the electronics pretty much figured out, we can move on to the funner, more creative aspects of designing the custom case. I'm going to be running you through all of my design iterations, including the wiring, and then we're going to move on to actually cutting a prototype. I want to thank you guys so much for watching all the way to the end. I really appreciate it. I have a ton more things to show you, so stay tuned for part 2, and I will see you in the next one.